Welcome to the webinar today. So we're going to learn how to configure Two-Way SSL using openSSL, and I'll also show you guys how to test that connection on Postman. Let's dive into what you'll learn today. So what you'll learn today, what is Two-Way SSL? We'll also learn how to establish the SSL connection. And then from there, we'll learn to configure Two-Way SSL Keystore using openSSL. From there, after that, we'll test our Two-Way SSL connection using Postman. And then we'll wrap it up with some Q&A. So what is Two-Way SSL? So before we even talk about Two-Way SSL, let's go way back to the basics. So what is SSL? So SSL stands for Secure Sockets Layer. And what does Secure Sockets Layer mean? Well, it's basically a fancy word for a protocol that helps you communicate securely on the internet. So this is implemented in two ways. So one-way SSL and two-way SSL. And so how do we make sure that we're sharing information with the right people? So we have to make sure that we're verifying the entities, right? So in SSL, there's going to be two parties involved, the client and the server. So the client here can be you using a browser, and then the server itself, for example, could be the Visa developer site. So you want to access the Visa developer site through your browser. So with one-way SSL, what happens is that you only need to verify the server's identity, right? The client can be anyone, because the server doesn't really care. We just want to make sure that it's the correct website that you're going to. With two-way SSL, you want to confirm both. You want to confirm and validate both identities. You want to make sure that the server is the correct server, and also that the client is who they say they are. So let's dive into how this happens. So to kind of exchange all this process is called the SSL handshake. So what happens here? So step one, the user will request access to a protected resource. So a protected resource is something like, say you want to access the website, or say for the Visa developer website, say you want to access one of the APIs. You want to use Visa Direct, or you want to use foreign exchange. So that's the protected resource that we're talking about here. So from there, the second step is that the server will then provide the certificate to the client. So it'll provide it to your browser, right? And then from there, that certificate will be verified. And if that against a certificate authority, and if that certificate is valid, it will then connect for one-way SSL. So this is an example of one-way SSL. So in this example, right, to reiterate, we've double-checked the server's identity. So with two-way SSL, or mutual auth, right, mutual authentication, we want to make sure to check also the clients. So after that, we're going to continue on our journey. So up to step 3, at this point, we verified the server's identity. So continuing on, once the server's identity is successfully identified, we're going to now check the clients. So the client will then send their certificate to the server. The server will take the client certificate and verify that against the certificate authority. So a little bit of detail about what exactly goes on here. So we want to make sure that the client certificate is valid. So what are we checking against? We're checking that it's not expired and that it's been issued by a trusted certificate authority. We also want to make sure that the digital signature from the client certificate is valid. So how does this digital signature get created? Well, it's produced using the private key that the client will have. So anyone who has a public key can validate a digital signature, right? But only the client can create that with the private key. So to reiterate, anyone can access or anyone can validate the digital signature with the public key, but only the private key that the client has can be used to create a valid signature. So once we validate the client's credentials against the client authority, the certificate authority, and that the signature and the certificate is valid, the server will then grant access to the protected resource. So at the beginning, say we wanted access to the foreign exchange API. So once we've gone through this entire handshake process here, if both parties are who they say they are, both parties are authenticated successfully, then the server will grant access to the client. So the client can access it successfully. All right. So, okay. So what are valid credentials needed to establish a connection? So you need 3 components here. So you'll need the private key, the client certificate, and the certificate authority root certificate. So what do each of these mean? So the private key is the one that we mentioned earlier. The private key is what you need to create that digital signature. The client certificate, on the other hand, is basically going to be our project credentials. So what I mean by project credentials is when you're on the Visa developer website and you select a bundle of different APIs, different products, this will be the project itself. And so the client certificate will be the project credentials for that particular project. And so for the client certificate, how do we create the client certificate? We'll need to create a client signing request, a CSR. So the CSR file itself will contain registration details, such as when you signed up, your country, locality, your organization, email address, things like that. And then it will also contain the public key from the client as well. So the process of creating the CSR itself will generate a private key and the CSR file as well. So when I show you today, you'll see we're going to be creating the private key and the CSR that is needed to create the client certificate that is needed to create the client certificate through the process of creating the CSR itself. So there are going to be multiple tools that you can use to create a CSR, such as the Java Key tool or openSSL. And both of the tools are widely available and are free to download from the internet. But for the scope of this webinar, we're going to focus on generating the CSR using openSSL, and then show you guys how to test that connection through Postman. So let's get started. But one more thing, just to focus, just remember the private key, client certificate, and the certificate authority root certificate. It's a mouthful, I know. Okay. So let's get to the meat of it, the demo itself. Let me share my screen. Okay, so, all right. So you guys can see my screen now. So let me show you guys where you guys can go to begin this process. So I'm already on the Two-Way SSL page here. So this is the documentation that kind of walks you through the whole process. But let me show you how to navigate there. We'll also have this in the resources tab. So don't worry, if you guys want to go there directly, you guys can navigate there. But if you guys are following along or you guys were wondering where it was, we go to APIs and then we go to working with Visa APIs. From there, we navigate over to this card here. that says authentication. So all our products on our site, all the APIs itself, require one of two authentications. So either XPay token or Two-Way SSL. I think most of our products are Two-Way SSL, but there's a couple that are XPay token. So we might cover that if you guys are interested in a separate webinar or in the forums itself. So let's head to Two-Way SSL. Okay, so in the documentation here, you guys can see that it has a reference to the tutorial video, to the whole handshake process, if you guys want to read up on it as well. And then there's a section here called Establishing SSL Connection. So we have two options here. So there's one to auto-generate the CSR and one to create your own CSR. So I'm going to talk about how to create your own CSR today. So we're going to configure it. We're going to create a Two-Way SSL Keystore using openSSL. So openSSL is an open source software library. So you can download that freely on the internet. So the first thing that we're going to do is that we're going to try to create, we're going to try to generate the CSR and the private key. So using openSSL here, what happens is that this will create the private key, and we'll name the file privatekey.pem. Very, very creative here. And then we'll also output the CSR as well. So what else happens during this process? So as we're generating it, it'll create the private key first. You'll enter in a passphrase for the private key. And then from there, it'll prompt you to enter in some of your registration details, such as country name, locality, things like that. And here in the reference, you can also see what characters are allowed. So we have space character, uppercase A to Z, alphanumeric, and then also dashes. And if you guys have any questions about any of the specific details that you need to enter, here they kind of dive into it. So country name expects a 2-character string. State also will expect full, for you to type in the full state or province here. Locality name refers to city. Organization name will be whatever organization you are, whether it's your own company or another company that you're working for. And then whatever division or section of the organization you're in. And then common name here is a domain name, is going to be asking for a domain name here. So you just want to enter in a qualified host name here. And so this one you don't have to concern yourselves with today. But if you are, because we're mostly focused on showing you guys how to connect through Sandbox, so you guys can get started playing around with their APIs. But this is more for cert and production, when you guys are ready to take your project to the next level. Okay, so let me show you this, and then we'll go on to the next steps. Okay, so in my folder here, you can see that I don't have anything. So let us create this CSR and private key. So taking this openSSL command, once again, we're going to create the private key and the CSR. So it will prompt you. So we've already created the private key. Woohoo! And then let's type in a passphrase, something that you will remember for the private key. Okay. And so now we're going to be prompted for all these registration details. So let me put in, so also if you enter in a dot, the field will be left blank. So let me type in the details I have. So country name, US, state, California, locality name, San Francisco, organization name, Visa, organizational unit name, Visa Developer Platform, common name, so services.visa.com. So you put in whichever host name you'll be using. I'm just going to have this one here. And then your email address. So visa.developer.demo@gmail.com. Okay, and then there's also an additional prompt here for a challenge password. You can feel free to add something. For now, I'm going to bypass it. All right, so we finished this process here, and let's see if we have the CSR and the private key. Oh, yes, we have created the CSR and the private key. All right, so now, if you remember from the slides, there were 3 components, right? So now we have one of the components. We have the private key. So now, let us keep going. The certificate authority. The certificate authority root certificate. Got to say the whole thing. Okay, so the next step would be to upload the CSR file to Visa Developer. So we're going to do that, and that will show you guys both the certificate authority root certificate and also the client certificate as well. First, while we're still in command line, let's finish up with creating the key store. So we're going to create a P12 certificate store using openSSL. So let's make sure that we have, okay. So let us open up terminal again. And then from there, we're going to take this command. So once again, we're using openSSL to create this cert bundle. So if you rename any of the keys, like say you rename it to, I don't know, the name of your project instead, make sure to update it in the command here. This just works with whatever has been with the commands that we've used so far. So let's take this. So private key, oh, whoopsies. Sorry, ahead of myself. So first we need the cert and certificate first before we create the P12 certificate store. So let's go log into our account here. All right, so with our dashboard here, let's create a new project. Okay, so say I have an idea for an app where we can check different currencies all over the world. So I'm going to call my app International Currency. And then you can type in a project description for this. You can call it anything like foreign exchange rates checker, something like that. And then, so from here in the project, you can select any of the projects that you think you'll use. We also have a nice reference docs as well, if you're curious about the different types of APIs. And also, if you guys have any particular use cases in mind, you guys can take a look at the use cases here. We'll have a couple scenarios laid out and which APIs would fit for those cases. So let us go to the foreign exchange one. So let's create a simple one first. And then from there, at the bottom, so because this one is a two-way SSL product, right? This will prompt you to submit a CSR. So the CSR here can be created one of 2 ways. So like I mentioned earlier, there's also an auto-generated option here. So that one is pretty quick. You can just select this and then it creates it for you. Or you can submit your own CSR, which is the CSR that we created earlier today. So let's take that. So let's browse. Let's find it. It's in this folder, cert request CSR. Okay, and now let's upload it. And we have our successfully created project with our manually created CSR. Awesome. Okay, so from here, in order to find the client certificate and the certificate authority root certificate, all of that will be in the credentials tab here. So in here, you can see that we have the project certificate and credentials. We have the user ID, password, and then we can also download the certificate here. So the certificate here will be your client certificate. It'll be the project certificate. And then, excuse me, there's also the common certificates here. So we can download this one. And this one will be the certificate authority root certificate. And then there's also a DigiCert root certificate authority here as well. So you can download it as well here. And then we can store it all neatly in the same place. So let's rename this without the 6. Okay. And feel free to rename it to whatever helps you guys remember which project has which certificate. Because if you guys have multiple projects, you guys might also download multiple certificates. So just rename it, and then also make sure when you're running the commands that you update it to the corresponding certificate name. Okay, so let's go back to the documentation here. So next, we're going to create the P12 certificate store that I was trying to do earlier. So now that we have both the certificate authority certificate and we also have the client certificate, we have the 3 items that we need to create a proper connection. So private key we have the client certificate, and now we have the root certificate, the client authority root. I'm just going to call it the root certificate. So we have that. Okay, so let us take this here and create it into a Keystore. So this will be the passphrase. It'll prompt you for the passphrase that we used for the private key earlier. And then you can type in an export password as well. So make it something that you can remember. Okay, and if we check, we have all the items that we need. So as a review, we have the private key, we have the client certificate, we have the certificate authority root certificate, and we also had the CSR, which was used to create the client certificate, right? So this one we don't need anymore, but this one was used to create the command itself was used to create the private key and also to generate the client certificate. And then we stored all of this into the Keystore here. So that should be that. And then if if we're in sandbox right now, we don't validate the BDP root certificate authority. So we don't have to include that in the P12 Keystore. But if you're using Java Keystore, so if you're not using openSSL, you need the root certificate. So make sure to add in the VDP. So make sure to add in this root certificate here when you're using Java key tool. Okay, and so then also during SSL handshake, BDP sandbox doesn't validate the root certificate. So we don't need the root certificate for the sandbox flow. So these are all the items that we have. We've created all the components that we need. So now let us test the connectivity. So there's 2 ways that you can test it. You can test using SOAP UI. And then they kind of walk you through how to set everything up, how to create a Hello World REST project. But today we're going to concern ourselves with Postman, which is arguably one of the easier ways. So Postman is free, and it's an open source API development solution. So download that on postman.com. And then once you have it installed, you can open up Postman and then go to File and Settings. So we're going to store the certificate now. So let me show you in Postman. So we're going to go here, and then we're going to go to Settings. Okay. So I already have a certificate created from before. So let me create another one to show you guys. Visa.com. And let me add in the cert files. VDP. Okay. Okay, so this will be asking for the client certificate. So we put in the cert.pem here. And then it'll also ask for the key file, which is your private key. So our private key here. And then the passphrase here will refer to the private key passphrase. So don't laugh at me. This is just for demo purposes. I swear I use better passwords just for the demo. Okay, so I'm gonna create this. So, and also remember the host here, sandbox.api.visa.com. I'll show you why. So we're gonna add this to certificates. Okay, so now we have this added in. And now let's dive into the connecting our project API with our local Postman. Okay, so here in foreign exchange rates, right, there's a lot of information here about what request attributes are needed. And then we also have the response attributes listed here. So if you were trying to get back the amount, the conversion rate, any of those details are covered here. So it's handily available in your project under API reference. So from there, you can also see even here on the side, we have an API Explorer that you guys can use to play around. So it lists out the request method, also the endpoint that you need to hit, and then what headers you need, and the body itself. So it gives you a sample payload here that you guys can use. And you guys can even edit it and play around with it as well. So basically what you're doing here is the same as what we're going to be doing in Postman, but we're going to be using our own certificates to double check all this. So, okay, so let's take this endpoint here. So as you can see, we're using sandbox.api.visa.com here. So that's why I configured the certificates so that any requests to this particular host will use the private key and the client certificate from there. So our client certificate will be available so that the server, sandbox.api.visa.com, can verify that we have access and we are who we say we are. So let's take this endpoint here, put it into the URL, and then for the get, let's change it to post to follow this, and application.json. So let's take the payload here, and in the body, we'll set it to raw and to application.json/JSON. And so we paste it in here. And so now we can see that the header is set to application/JSON. So let's double check with what we have here. So we have the URL, we have the request method, and we have it with content type application/JSON. Only thing missing now is the authorization. So authorization is asking for a base 64 encoded user ID and password. So where do we have this? We have this inside our project. So let me duplicate this tab. So let's go back into our project. International currency app. Credentials. And we have our user ID and credentials here, or in our password here. So let's take this and let's go to authorization. So let's do basic auth. So we put in the username, and then we're going to take the password here. And then double check everything's right. And once we have that added, we have everything that we need. So we now have the endpoint, the request method, the type, the content type, and also the authorization. So let us try hitting this endpoint now. All right, so we can see we get conversion rate, we get destination amount, and we get markup rate applied, all of the details that are provided in the response here. So that is how you guys connect Two-Way SSL. Connect with Two-Way SSL with Visa APIs. So this is that for the demo. So let me stop sharing. Okay. So one more thing, I guess, to kind of review and to summarize everything. So what did we learn today? We learned what Two-Way SSL was. We also created a Keystore using openSSL. We also manually created the CSR using openSSL. And we've also shown you how to connect to Visa APIs using Postman. So that's that for the demo today. So feel free to ask any questions that you have in the Q&A. And also for the swag part, the best part, share what you learned today with other devs in the community. And we'll send you guys a Visa developer water bottle. So this water bottle is stainless steel and white, and it looks really. So how you can do that is that you head to the Two-Way SSL webinar dev notes thread. There should be a particular thread on our board in the forum. And then you can share the community any tips you have for better understanding Two-Way SSL. What did you learn? What should new devs keep in mind? Especially those people that have done this before. Feel free to help out anyone who's new, who's getting started. And then we'll send you guys a new edition of the Visa Developer water bottle and a webinar badge as well. So feel free to type in some feedback there, also to share some tips. All of that, put that in the community. All right. Okay. So the last part is drumbeat Q&A. Okay, so we're gonna read out a couple questions and answer them live for you guys. So I'll have Ritesh and Vivek answer some of your questions. Also, just wanted to say thank you to Ritesh and Vivek for answering your questions. If throughout the webinar you guys are typing in questions and you guys are having them answered, Ritesh and Vivek are working really hard there. So let me pass on the Q&A to Ritesh.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Yep. So I have one question from Julian. Thanks, Julian, for posting your query. So what I'm understanding from your question, looks like you are trying to use Visa feature select API by .NET. You are using the .NET language. And the SOAP UI is working fine, but .NET has some issues. So Julian, we have a lot of sample codes and with different language supports on the VDP portal. So when you, including the .NET as well, so when you go to project detail page, in the last panel, you will see the sample code section, right? So from there, you can download. It's very straightforward. What you need to do after download, you need to just configure the certificate path and the Keystore password and the username password for your authentication. So that's pretty much, and that will help you to set up your .NET. And even if after that you are facing any issue, yeah, feel free to send an email. We will be happy to answer and help you in tracking things now. Yes.
All right. Thank you, Ritesh. So Vivek, did you have any questions?
Yeah. So one question came in, and this is from Frank. Thank you for your question. The question is, what is the purpose of a CSR, and is a CSR only relevant when establishing a two-way SSL connection, or is it also relevant for one-way SSL? So a CSR is, or a certificate signing request is, yes, it does apply only to the two-way SSL connection. In case of one-way SSL, it's basically, as the name suggests, it's only the server which is the client which is validating the server, whereas in the case of two-way SSL, it's the server which validates the client as well as the client validating the server. So in that case, you have to submit a CSR. So you submit a CSR to Visa. Visa provides you a signed certificate with that. And when you're actually making an API call, you present that client certificate, which was the cert.dem, which you would have seen in the demo. And that is a way for Visa to identify that this client is who they say they are, and that's the client is validating the server, and the server is validating the client. So that is the two-way SSL. There was another question as well from Julian. Thanks, Julian. So the question is there a version of Visa Feature Select API that is REST-based? So I think for this one, I'm not aware of this. So I think you can just post the question on our community page, and we'll have that answer.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Vivek. I hope that answered your guys' questions. So, all right. So I have a couple questions here coming in from you guys. So, Nathan, yeah, thank you so much for joining. For Windows users, yeah, you can download it from the website that you have there. Also, if you want to download later, we also will provide it in the resources tab later. So you can download there as well. So no worries. You can download that for Windows users. And then, all right, so Jean, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Jean from McCrae. Can you give an example of one-way SSL and what's the difference? So perhaps, so I covered that earlier in the presentation. So one-way SSL versus two-way SSL is that one-way SSL only needs to validate the server, right? So the client only needs to validate the server. So with SSL, you only need to validate, you have to authenticate both parties, right? The client and the server, to make sure that we're communicating securely, right? So with one-way SSL, you have to only validate the server, but with two-way SSL, you want to validate both the server and the client, right? So both parties, everyone needs to be validated. So that's the big difference. And an example of one-way SSL would be if so for example, you're trying to access Visa developer website, or say you're trying to access google.com, right? So you as the client don't need to be validated, right? You can just access the site. But on the other hand, the client, your browser, will need to verify google.com or Visa developer, the Visa developer site, right? So that's one example of one-way SSL. So I hope that answered your questions. Let's see, there's also anything that, also Balaji, yeah, I'm glad you learned a lot. I hope that you are able to get it working. Let's see. And then also, so Kevin from Royal Bank of Canada. So why generate the P12 other than having a single key file? Cert, private key, cert authority, root optional. So those items, so the P12 basically you'll use when you're actually integrating it to your app. So if you see on the side of on your project itself, there's some sample code, right? So in the sample code itself, it'll require the private key, the client certificate file, and also the P12, right? So you'll use that there when you're actually integrating it into your project. So that's why we're generating the Keystore. But if you're just connecting from Postman, yeah, you don't need the key bundle at all, the P12 key bundle at all. And the CA root is optional for openSSL, if you're using openSSL in Sandbox. So I hope that answered your question. Okay. Let me see if there's any other questions coming in. So, Kevin from Elevon, sorry. What's the use case for one-way SSL? So like I was saying, like if it's like you want your server to be public, like you want people to be able to access your server, right, from wherever. Say it's like a website, say, I don't know, your resume or something like that. You want people to be able to access it, right? You don't need to verify them, right? You would then use one-way SSL over two-way SSL. Okay. And okay, so Lester from Kino. Some APIs also require message level encryption. Do you plan to do a webinar on those later? So you can post that in the community and also in the forums. We might schedule something along the way, so keep your eyes peeled for that. But that's a good suggestion. And let's see. Do you have any SDKs for your API endpoints? So for that, if you guys want to play around with the APIs, what we would recommend is the sample code. So the sample code will be in your project. On the side, there should be a tab that says sample code. So you guys can play around with that to kind of get used to how the API should work from your IDE, from your development standpoint. Also, there's a snippet of sample code available at the bottom of the Two-Way SSL documentation. So you guys can use that as a reference to kind of plug that into whatever project that you guys have. Okay, so Gennaro Antonio, sorry if I butcher your name, really apologize, from Digital Wallet. Do I always have to use Two-Way SSL for using the Visa API? So Two-Way SSL is only required for certain products. So I think most of Visa products are Two-Way SSL. So in general, you'll probably have to use Two-Way SSL, but there are a couple products that are XPay token, which is definitely infinitely an easier flow. But with Two-Way SSL, though, see if you need a CSR. So that's how you will know if you need to do Two-Way SSL or if it's an XPay token app. Also, another thing is that you can also check in the reference of the API for whichever API you are interested in. It'll tell you what authentication method is needed, whether it's XPay token or Two-Way SSL. So thank you for joining. Let's see. Okay. Oh, thank you for joining, Ahmad from G+D. Thanks a lot. Glad you found it helpful. Let's see. So Mohammed Dekna from RS2 Software. Is there a limit, daily or otherwise, on the number of API requests? I think from Sandbox, we probably don't have a limit. Maybe Ritesh or Vivek can interrupt me if I'm wrong, but I think from Sandbox level, you guys can play around with the APIs as much as you want.
Yeah, so Shana, we do have the rate limiting, quota limiting. So that thresholds are there basically. So we have some limits on the API. Yeah.
So maybe there is some quota, but probably the amount of API requests you're making probably won't hit the limit, is what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
But if you do have any problems still, feel free to reach out to us through email or through to contact us directly on the site. I'll show you guys that later. All right. Thank you, Lester.
There are a couple of more questions. Yeah. I can answer a couple of questions. So there's one on .NET Core. So there's a question from Mohammed. Thanks, Mohammed. Do you have any .NET Core sample project? I found for .NET 4.6.1, but not for .NET Core. So for again for C#, we have, if you go to the Visa developer website and the working with Visa APIs, in the Two-Way SSL section, the authentication page, you will find at the bottom, you'll find a snippet with C# code. Also, that is one place. Also, if you create a project and you go to your project details page, on the left side, you'll see a sample code button, which also has C# code. Then there's another question from Christoph. What happens if we send a request without an SSL certificate? So typically, if you send a request without an SSL certificate, the server will reject your request. So that you'll get a response code of 401 saying expected input credential with an appropriate error message, which is like expected credential was not present.
Okay. So I hope those helped you guys. It looks like there's another question. There's a bunch more questions coming in. So from Alvaro, from Plusty. All right, thanks for joining. So hi, what about the first option, the auto-generated CSR? So yeah, so sharp eyes there, Alvaro. So whenever you guys are trying to create a project that requires mutual authentication, Two-Way SSL, they'll give you an option to submit your own CSR, which is what we did today, or to auto-generate the CSR. So that one's a lot easier, definitely. So for that one, all you need to do is just select that option and then create it. And then from there, it'll prompt you to download the private key. Because basically what happens is that it just does the same thing where it creates a private key for you and the CSR for you, right? So it's the same flow as what we're doing, except that it just does it for you all in the back end. And so I guess the next question would be, why would you want to manually generate your own CSR when there's an auto-generated option, right? So sometimes maybe you want to tweak like the organization, say like some of the registration details are different. You can tweak that all in the manual one. You would have more control over that. So that's one reason why you would use the manual. Also, another reason could be that maybe you want to have more control. You want to kind of see how to generate the whole CSR process. That's also another reason why. So thank you for your question. Okay, so let's see. So from Jimmy Lai from Swift Payments, can we develop our own products with the APIs if it's already out in the market? Yeah, you guys can. So today what I covered was the sandbox flow, right? So you guys can play around with the APIs and kind of use it for whatever ideas you guys have. I guess maybe, I hope I'm not misconstruing your question, but say you're trying to create another option for like, I don't know, like you're trying to create another app that's kind of like Venmo or like the Square Cash app, right? So for that, it's totally fine if you guys create something similar using Visa APIs. You probably use Visa Direct in that case, where you can just send and push funds. You can push funds easily there. So I hope that answers your question, Jimmy. So yeah, feel free to use it. But then once you want to take it from sandbox to production, we can walk you through that in another webinar, but also contact us directly if you want to move your application/project from sandbox to a higher environment. Oh, I see, for VMPI. I think that should probably be fine, but reach out us directly if you have more questions about that, Jimmy. Thanks for your questions. Okay, so it looks like we have only a couple more minutes. And thank you so much for joining, everyone. Thank you for all the questions. If you guys have any more questions, or if trying to get started, please reach out to us. You guys can email us directly, or you guys can also use the contact us page. From there, you can select whatever subject, whatever issue you're facing, and then reach out to us. Also, use the forums and the community tab. Take a look at that. Engage with your fellow developers. See if maybe they've hit the same snag, and if they have any tips or any helpful solutions. We also have a very helpful support page with commonly asked questions. So take a look there. Hopefully you guys can find your answer there, and a glossary as well if you guys are confused by any of the terms. So thank you so much for joining. I hope everyone learned something today. Stay safe, stay protected, stay healthy, stay indoors. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much. And also a shout out, thank you to Ritesh and Vivek for working in the back end, answering all the questions. And, I'm sure you guys will see more of them in the future. So thank you so much. And feel free to ask more questions in the community page. I look to hear what you guys have to say. And also the survey, please. I want to see what feedback you guys have for me.